This podcast series is entitled The Data Center Industrial Complex, and this episode is called The Faceless Suit People.
This is the first project of the new Environmental Media Lab, supported by the Faculty of Arts at the University of Calgary and the Social Science Humanities Research Council.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to our second episode. This is Sean Willett.
And Mel Hogan.
And this episode we're going to be getting a little bit more specific. So for the first episode, we tried to give a broad, overarching view of the data center as an object of study across different academic approaches. And this episode, we want to get a little bit more specific, specifically the visibility of data centers, how we see data centers, how we think about data centers, and how data centers in turn see us, and everything that implies.
Yeah, so in creating this four-part series, four-ish parts, we're not sure, there may be fewer, maybe a bit more, but one of the main themes that kept surfacing was in and around surveillance, and so we decided to dedicate this particular episode to surveillance in relation to visibility, invisibility, the place of the human within the data center, the kind of affective relationships we have with this infrastructure, and so on.
Yeah. So the first person we're going to be hearing from today is someone we already heard from in our last episode. It is Alex Taylor, a researcher out of the University of Cambridge, who is interested in the way that data centers are presented as being places without people.
In addition to that, Alex really conveys this idea of, we're not really supposed to be there. Us humans are not really supposed to be in these spaces that are data centers, and he explains a little bit why and how that came to be.
I was basically talking about the lack of people in imaginaries and images of data centers. I was interested in sort of the ways that we don't picture people in these places, and the way that sort of erases labor, and how that sort of relates. I mean, I sort of brought it into relation with images of wilderness, and sort of try to make these parallels between sort of wilderness images and data centers as some sort of technological wilderness space.
So what Alex is touching on here is this idea that there is this very specific image of data centers that is being sold to us as a general public. This image that the people who create and run and own these data centers wants us to have of these places. And as he said, it's not one with a lot of people in it. It is this technological wilderness of these rows of server rooms, of pristine, glimmering, perfect technology.
Yeah, and a good way into that is even just to Google data centers, and you'll see a highly curated, highly aestheticized representation of data centers. And same with, if you look at Amazon and you Google Amazon data centers, you'll see animals frolicking, in and through the solar panels that are supposedly, help to support that infrastructure, or Microsoft will show you its underwater data center. So these are not invisible per se, they're not hidden per se, but there is work being done to curate a particular modern imaginary around these. And one good piece to look at that speaks to this kind of hypervisibility is Jennifer Holt and Patrick Vondero's Where the Internet Lives, Data Centers as Cloud Infrastructure, and that's in Signal Traffic, Critical Studies of Media Infrastructures, edited by Lisa Parks and Nicole Starozilski.
Which is definitely required reading for someone who is interested in data centers as an object of study. But yeah, you see the parts of data centers that they want you to see, and as Alex Taylor continues here, you don't see the parts that they don't want you to see.
Yeah, we have got this image of a very sterile, very clean environment, and you don't really sort of imagine the debris, the wires everywhere if they're not organised neatly, the cardboard boxes lying around from deliveries, all these sorts of things, footprints from just wet weather outside. So I guess it would be Yeah, it's kind of interesting to sort of put that back into the picture, the sort of dirt and mess of these spaces that you don't normally imagine. I mean, even in this sort of the sort of hyper clean data centers, there are still areas where it is messy and dirty. Again, these are areas that sort of you don't really imagine. The sort of, I don't know, the sort of de-peopled areas. Really, you've got the kitchens that have always got dirty plates that haven't been washed. You've got the sort of waiting room areas with leaves and stuff that people have dragged in. So you've got all these sort of, I guess unclean spaces as well.
One of the consequences of this really precise image building being undertaken by data center owner and operators is that we not only have this very specific vision of what a data center should look like, but we also end up getting this impression of how data itself should be treated, or how we should start thinking about data. One that makes it seem like this precious object that has to be cultivated and stored very carefully in these very highly secure and highly sanitized places.
And one of the reasons we wanted to speak with Alex Taylor in particular is that most of his work focuses on the data center specifically as a non-human environment and the consequences of that.
Yeah, the consequences of having the space that, whether it truly is this or not, is supposed to be the space that is entirely for the cultivation and maintenance of data.
What he calls the domain of data.
A lot of the workshops I went to, especially the training workshops, they were highlighting the importance that these aren't human environments and the way that they're not designed to be sort of inhabited by humans. So I found this idea of it as a place where sort of data live and thrive, or this sort of this idea of creating a habitat for data. I found that really interesting, like what people are imagining data to be, to create these conditions for, I guess, producing data or looking after data and storing it as if it's, like some people have been saying here, more like a sort of a genetic material or something like that, like the way you would store it in seed banks or some sort of, in some other things I've compared it to like crystals, like in caves and stuff, the way they sort of imagine these precious things that they're trying to sort of harness and sort of encourage to grow in a way. So there's these really weird ideas of where humans don't belong here. It's a sort of domain of data, and it's interesting to think about the way they think of these as non-human environments, even though these are places where they are working in and constantly in, but yet you've still got this idea that they are somehow not human.
So something interesting that Taylor brought up in that last little soundbite was his comparison between the way data is treated in these data centers and the way that genetic material is stored.
Yeah, so he mentions that rather quickly, but that's actually something that we want to build an entire episode around, both the idea of a sort of a genomics pipeline and also the idea of synthetic DNA as data storage. So there's a lot to look at and compare with data and DNA, both in terms of these genomic pipelines, the kind of infrastructure required to circulate, sequence genomic material, genetic material, and also those spaces as spaces of storage for this idea of preserving life.
Yeah, of actually storing data within DNA, within life, and the consequences of that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That will be a topic of a future episode. For now, let's get back to these issues of visibility and invisibility. So we just talked about hypervisibility, this idea of data center companies projecting this very specific image of how they want you to think about data centers. But the reality is that most data centers are not these flagship, highly publicized, highly visible data centers that you'll see if you look up Google data centers or Amazon data centers. In reality, most of them are pretty much completely invisible. You would not notice them walking by them. That their existence is not really documented in newspapers. It's not published when they're being built or created. They're built quietly. They look very unassuming, and you've probably walked by dozens without noticing it.
Yeah, so I think when we think of data centers, if we think about them at all, we think of the sort of Google, Amazon type data centers, and those constitute a very tiny percentage of data centers in the world. And as our next speaker, Tor Minde, who directs basically a research center around data centers, speaks of his own experience of what a data center can look like. It can be something as simple as a container on the side of the road.
And that is one reason we also needed to build our own data center. for doing research. Because don't get any data out of any of the commercial data centers. We almost don't know where they are. Now some are so big so they cannot hide, but you don't get access to data. You don't get access to the data centers to do measurements. So you need to build your own if you're going to do real experiments and trials and test your. You can simulate, but simulation needs to be verified with the real thing. And it happens here in the north. I was out biking here in Luleå one day, biking to town, and suddenly when I'm biking, I can see on my, I don't know what it's called. You see it on the side. You notice there is something there, but usually you don't care about what you see on the side But something triggered me that I had to take a look what it was, and it was 4 containers. And as I took a look at those 4 containers, I had to stop because this looked like data center containers. So I started to look and I checked, and it's 1 power distribution container. Seems to be 2 IT containers and 1 cooling container. And they were all linked together, and there's a new data center here somewhere. So no one have said there is no news about that data center, but there is a data center that's built of containers here in this region. That I suddenly saw just by biking past it.
So when I visited Torminde, I was up in Luleå in the north of Sweden doing some ethnographic work, and I also jumped on a bike, as people there do, and I biked by the Facebook data center up there, and I remember just feeling creeped out. And I think that has a lot to do with, everything from Facebook starting off as FaceMash, a site that essentially compared the quote, or rated the quote-unquote hotness of women. There's something pretty off-putting about seeing just how huge it's become. And so there were security guards at the front. They were building a fence. It was still under construction. But it also, you could tell, in terms of its presence in the town, it was very important. And I feel like in some sense people had lost sight of essentially what Facebook was. I had a very complicated relationship with it. And as an outsider going in, I was just feeling a little bit like I could bike by and take some quick photos, but I certainly didn't really want to spend too much time around that data center. And if we think about why that is, why we're so uneasy around these infrastructures, I think that's a really interesting thing to consider.
Yeah, and that unease is something that our next guest, if you will, brings up in a pretty interesting way. So the next person we talk to is Matt Parker, who is an audio artist who has in the past worked with the sounds and ambient noise produced by data centers. And he recounts a story of visiting a data center and the eeriness of that experience when he gets to see a part of the data center that people who work in the data center even very rarely get to see.
So one of the very early trips I made was to Iceland, and I went to a really big data center in Iceland. And I was with a group which included the chief technology officer for this place. So he's like one of the most senior members of the staff for this company. And we were touring around the data center, and he was showing us like all these rooms. And then he was like, okay, here's this room which is called the point of entry. So the point of entry is this really important space where the cables from the outside kind of wider communications infrastructure come into the building and then connect with everything that's inside the data center. And this room was locked, and the CTO, I guess the second most senior member of this business, wasn't able to get access to this room. So we had to call a security guard to give us access to this room. And you phoned the security guy. The guy came along after a few minutes, and we'd been waiting outside. And then we went he opened the door and went into this room. And we'd been in the data center looking at all these like kind of server rack rooms, just like full of these rows and rows of like generic looking kind of cabinets with computers inside them. And we'd been in the plant rooms, which is where all this sort of like not coal, where all of the kind of, like the heavy industrial plant that's kind of like the backbone of this structure, this facility exists. And we'd seen all this kind of industrial space. And then we opened up this room, and it was it was almost like a gallery space. It was just completely white walled, almost nothing in it, except for as you came down, there was like a set of steps that led down into the room. And at the bottom of the set of steps, there was this painting. And it was kind of like a bit like the René Magritte painting with the man with the hat and the apple in front. I can't remember the name of the painting, but the characters had the same kind of shape. And there was 3 of them in suits without any face. They were just like faceless suit people in a kind of triptych kind of structure, like the shape, just in this room. And then in the middle of the room, there was this tiny box, which is where the cable was situated. Nothing else other than the painting, that, and then like a Barker lounger chair. Really, really weird. And I think I became a bit obsessed with trying to get access to the point of entry rooms. And for some reason, I think I've been to like 12 data centers, something like that. And I've only ever actually made it into a room with a point of entry one other time. And I think there's like some weird kind of cult thing going on with point of entry rooms where there's like this sort of, there's always like some kind of weird cult thing happening inside with like these weird paintings or like Barker lounges and strange stuff. There was one time in this Equinix data center that I went to where we were like adamant that we wanted to see the point of entry room, and this person took us to this space and said, this is the point of entry room. And it was like a service room with like all the cables like cut out of it and stuff. And it was just like, oh, we thought this was the point of entry room. I don't know where it is. So I think there's like something going on here, and we need to dig deep and find out what the deal is with this kind of. I mean, because I heard that there's this thing about like, the infrastructure masons, this kind of like cult thing that's being like set up by some guys that work in that industry, and I want to know more about what they're up to. I'm very suspicious. Yeah, so I mean, it's almost like it's barely anything because it is just the cable from the outside infrastructure, like the telecoms cable comes into the room, and then it connects to the facility. Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone ever goes in there. You can't get access to that room, but I'm trying to imagine how maybe, I mean, the CTO can get access, but maybe the CEO likes to go in there and just sit and smoke an imaginary cigar or something, just chilling, looking at his masterpiece. I don't know.
So something interesting there that caught my attention, besides, of course, the creepy painting of the faceless suit people, was the security measures in place. Like, even the chief technology officer of this data center company couldn't access this point of access room and needed a security guard to come let him in. It's this performative defensiveness, this securitization of the entire data center industry that I think is very interesting, because it is a way of almost making the data and the things that they're keeping and storing seem more important and more vulnerable than possibly it really is.
Yeah, and it's sort of in line with that unease, that sort of affective relationship we have, this kind of baked-in hostility, this idea almost of an ambiguous kind of ownership. If not the chief technology officer, if not those people, then who can be said to own and or control or essentially manage that data?
And that also goes back into this idea of these places not being human, of these places being alien and sterile and just a place for technology. It's not a place that humans are supposed to be in or allowed to be in a lot of cases. It also ends up being a way that these data center companies can selectively choose to show which parts of their data centers look the best. We've already talked about this earlier in the episode, but you're not seeing the entire picture when you go to visit a data center. And as Matt Parker mentions here, when he went to go see a data center with Mel Hogan and a bunch of other scholars, they were only shown very selective parts of that data center.
And a lot of us actually talked about this kind of data center tour fatigue as researchers, because it's really just an extension of a kind of PR brochure, right? They let you into a particular space, and more or less these spaces look the same from one data center to another. So it's a way of limiting. It's both providing access and limiting the ways in which you can then interpret the data center. And so a lot of us have been wondering as scholars whether access to the data center is essential for writing about them, for thinking about them, for analyzing them. And a lot of people started to think and write about them from other means beyond these tours, which is also really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Because when you're on these tours, you're seeing the shiny server racks. You're seeing the, as Matt Parker says in this upcoming clip, things like the admin spaces that are neat and organized and taken care of, but you don't necessarily see the maybe more unsavory aspects of the data center operations.
Yeah, people don't generally show you the kind of the plant infrastructure. You kind of tend to get taken into, unless you push it. If you do go on a tour, I think most corporate tours, you tend to just get shown like an administrative area where people are working, and then maybe one or two server rooms, and there's some racks, and you see that, and then you walk around some corridors, and you go through like one of the man trap type things, but you rarely get taken into the kind of behind the scenes of that aspect of things, as if that's not interesting as well. I don't know, but it is, it's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, for example, we were in the data center we were at yesterday. We had the CEO of the company was talking about how amazing it was that they had a former German submarine boat engine as their backup generator, which could hardly ever have been efficient. And the fact that there are these masses of diesel generators behind, the bigger the data center, the more diesel generators there are, and they have to test them regularly, so they're always getting used. And yeah, that's kind of meant to be this sort of backup to supply them for a day if there's a fallout of the electrical power grid. But I mean, it means that they have huge quantities of fuel just sat in a dump next to this kind of massive technological facility. Yeah, I think that kind of stuff, they like to kind of glance over it and think more about some kind of abstract idea about how there's some wind farm somewhere, or a geothermal energy supply from somewhere that you can't kind of challenge directly because it's somewhere else.
We just heard from Matt Parker, and I would invite everyone to take some time to watch a web-based 6-part documentary series that gets to the bottom of the internet. It's called The People's Cloud. It's available online, and it investigates the ecological impacts of cloud computing on the lives of those who use it, the places it is physically located, and the people who work to maintain it.
That and more of Matt Parker's work will be linked in the description of this episode. So we've spent the first part of this episode talking about the way that we view data centers and the sort of complicated, messy interplay between the highly visible and the invisible. But for the second part of this episode, we want to flip that around and talk about how data centers view us. Because for a large percentage of these data centers, what they store, what they exist to contain and cultivate, is data about you, as explained by the next person we talked to here, who you also might remember from the first episode, Asta von der Rau, an anthropologist out of Martin Luther University in Germany.
Yeah, often, internet is not, it doesn't cost us much, but how can this be, of course? So if those companies don't earn much from the users in that sense, but we don't pay much for internet. So what do they? How do they earn the money? And one way, of course, is big data, and which we generate for them. There are listed categories of data which Facebook keeps about you, and it's of course very, very complicated to get it back and to find out what they have.
So in a way, as Asta brings up, data is almost a form of currency now. It's something with value that is harvested and traded, and it is so important to the ongoing profit and operations of these massive global corporations.
Yeah, and I think Asta has a really nice, simple way of explaining the ways in which our data trails essentially generate money for big tech to sustain its infrastructure. And this is really at the heart of this idea of the data center industrial complex as well.
Yeah, and one of the most, maybe nefarious isn't the right word, but I'll use it for now, nefarious parts about all of this is that it's not just the data that you're giving it consciously, as Asta brings up in this next segment. It's not just the stuff that you're posting, but it's the stuff that you're unconsciously sharing, the patterns of activity of how you interact with the internet and how you navigate the internet that is also being stored.
Maybe Facebook is not even the best example, because we are like on Facebook, normally we post intentionally. So this is something one can imagine quite easily, that this data somehow is stored. But even the American scholar Melissa Gregg, I think she called it like data sweat, that everything you do, all your movements, all the clicks you do unintentionally maybe online are also stored or are part of this information which companies often store.
So if these companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, are collecting all this data and they're storing it in all these data centers, you may be wondering, what exactly is all of this data being used for? And one of the most common applications is in something as seemingly banal as targeted advertising. This is still how companies like Google and Facebook make large proportions of their revenue. I think Google makes almost all of its revenue still through ad sales, with the idea that they can use your data to build essentially a profile of you and your habits to more effectively sort you into a demographic that can then be sold to advertisers looking to sell products or services to that demographic. As you may have noticed in your experience on the internet, these ads aren't always necessarily spot on, but as Asta explains here, that's usually not exactly the point.
But I mean, I wouldn't want to spread big anxieties about that, because I think it's even funny if you think what kind of advertisement you normally get on your computer. If you take into account, think about it, how much data those companies probably have about you and what do you get, and mostly it doesn't fit at all. So I think those mechanisms are not perfect, and maybe those possibilities to control are also still limited. But I think that also IT companies don't really care often about if it's somehow working in the long term. But I think that very important is just it's a time of big data. It's this trend now, and to earn as much money as possible right now, just saying, well, we are doing big data analysis, we are selling it, it's very good, it's our future. But I wouldn't necessarily believe that all that is really working.
So an interesting thing that Asta mentions there is this idea that these ads might not necessarily always work. I can't remember the last time I actually saw a targeted ad, especially the really hyper-specific, strange ones you get on Facebook, and thought oh, this is exactly what I wanted, I need to buy this, and then immediately purchase whatever it was selling me. Because that's not really the point. The point is that there's this idea that these things work, this idea that if they do get enough data, that if Facebook or Google finally builds this accurate enough profile of you, then the companies that want to use that data will have this sort of complete control or mastery over your psyche, that there's this promise that eventually it will get to that point.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So the idea of big data is that it holds sort of this perpetual promise. And I think that that's fascinating in terms of sort of the kind of mindset that affords, that just more data is always bringing us a little bit closer to the truth. So we just have to sit tight and really just believe essentially that what we're lacking is enough data or enough specific data to then generate this big reveal of one kind or another.
And it's obviously a very compelling promise because it's a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. So enough people have enough faith in this promise that they're willing to put a lot of money into it. But so far we've been talking about how companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft are storing your data and this idea of keeping your data safe from these companies. But there's another level to this, and the one that we brought up in the beginning of the episode, which is not just data collection from these companies, but surveillance by governments, and in particular, often the United States government.
Yeah, so I think especially since the Snowden revelations, people are a little bit more familiar with the NSA data center, in the sense that the sort of material infrastructure, where the cables land and the kind of spaces they circulate through, really become these points of interception as well. So it's not just kind of the access to the data, it's also in the hardware, the cables, the specific locations of these sites that become also sites of surveillance, or the surveillance apparatus.
Yeah, if you think it's difficult to try to keep your data or to get your data back from Facebook, it's an entire other ordeal to try to avoid having your data fall into the hands of the US government, as explained by the next researcher we talked with, who was also in the first episode. This is Anne Pasek, a researcher who is mostly concerned with Microsoft's Azure cloud.
And I just want to say, when we interviewed her, she was based in the US, in New York, and now she is up in Alberta.
What I found out looking at Microsoft's Azure cloud network is that if you do have a geographically based concern for surveillance, say, for example, you know that the United States does have a habit of peeking into data packets moving through its physical borders, you can choose to very specifically route your data through proprietary infrastructural systems that Microsoft has set up across every single continent except for Antarctica, crossing every single ocean. So there are ways in which, at the upper limit of scale that we're seeing in data center structures, you can sort of play the geopolitics of data storage. But I think for the average consumer, people who aren't, setting up their own cloud services as a client of Microsoft Azure, folks who are just, storing their stuff in their inbox or moving things into a Dropbox account, we don't have that granularity of information, and we don't have those guarantees.
As Anne was saying, it's incredibly difficult to opt out, or basically impossible to opt out, of having your information collected by things like the NSA. And as with any other kind of data, as with the data collected by Facebook, Google, Microsoft, this data is then going into a data center somewhere, into a physical place where it can be stored and kept for later analysis.
And there's a lot of rather covert government agencies that are turning to these data centers to host special confidential software and special confidential data, particularly with Immigration and Customs Enforcement here in the United States. And the NSA, Snell's own research details, tends to involve a physical site where a growing amount of data sits.
Another important thing to remember here is that the NSA and other surveillance organizations aren't just collecting data on their own. They're also making use of the data collecting services of other companies who are collecting data. If they want data that has been collected by a company like Google, Apple, Facebook, any of these companies, they generally have the means and capabilities of getting that data quite easily.
Yeah, and I think there's not much accountability or understanding even by the people who manage data centers. And, some of the stories I heard when I was touring data centers, and I would go back to the same data center a few times, so it would become a little more familiar in terms of field work. We would get to know each other, and it would turn more into sort of this story form. And some of the anecdotes that I was told, without revealing necessarily the particular site of this data center, let's just say it was a very large one based in the US. And, they would tell me stories like one day the FBI came in and essentially took the equivalent of a USB stick, plugged it into a kind of server, and pulled out, something like a particular file. Like, it was just very precise in terms of their knowledge of where something might be located on these servers. And why that's interesting is that the people managing these data centers, really sort of the head honchos, really had no idea themselves of what was located where. Even when you circulate in these data centers, the big co-location sites, there's nothing on the door that says Google or X company or anything. And so all of that is left intentionally for security reasons very ambiguous. And then to have someone come in and just pull out a file is really, I think, quite telling. And that they were surprised, and that, I think in some sense we're retelling this story maybe a little bit out of turn, but it was super interesting as a researcher. The other thing that they told me at the same data center was at one point there were protests in the city that were completely unrelated to the data center, but because the data center was in proximity to these events, Homeland Security was sent out to guard the data center. And no one from the data center had called them. It was just someone had taken this on. There's almost this automated, process by which data centers become these highly guarded, protected sites, and it's not clear who's in charge.
And to be clear, this also wasn't a government data center. This was a private data center.
Private co-location, very large, probably worth billions of dollars, et cetera. But yeah, so I find that those anecdotes, when you do research, when you get into the data centers, sometimes the sort of stories that emerge are more interesting than the tours that you get.
Oh, definitely. And what also starts to emerge is this sense that, like, the U.S. surveillance apparatus is sort of inextricably linked to the data center industry, to the storage and processing of data within not only the United States, but all around the world. And our final researcher that we talked to for this episode is interested in exactly that, in how other places outside of the United States can even begin to attempt to extract themselves from this system of U.S. surveillance and broader U.S. digital imperialism.
So we'll hear from Alex Johnson, who's currently based at the University of Florida.
And she has done most of her research in Iceland, where she has looked at an ongoing project to do what we've been saying, what seems to be sort of impossible, to develop an alternative internet infrastructure that does not interface with the United States. But as she found, and as the people who attempted to build this project found, that is a lot more difficult than it sounds.
The way that I came to this research was actually not through data centers at all. So I started doing research on information politics in Iceland around 2010 and was really interested in this project there called the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, which was really a political program to try and pass a set of laws that would make Iceland an appealing place for information, right? So stuff like net neutrality, things like personal data protections, things that would kind of insulate Iceland as a jurisdiction, as a place where people, whether it's individuals or companies or like media outlets or activists, would be able to store their information, and it would be, as they would describe it, safe and free. So I actually went to Iceland to study all of this stuff. I was talking to a lot of activists, a lot of officials, and what I was hearing over and over again is that a major kind of obstacle they were running into, aside from just the political kind of practice of getting this pushed through Parliament, is the infrastructure and the hardware that everyone is forced to use is vulnerable to surveillance in a way that actually kind of undermines that project from the start, right? So after the Snowden revelations, we found out that the international fiber optic cables that carry data internationally, that those are able to be tapped, and in fact are. We also know that a lot of hardware, from the servers and routers and switches that people use, a lot of that is American made. And so there's a concern that there could be backdoors built in. And so, what I was finding was that all of these sort of high-minded ideas about information freedom and information security kind of broke down at the level of the physical infrastructure. And that's how I started looking into data centers in the first place, as well as some of these other kinds of infrastructures and hardware that go into kind of making data and managing it and making it move. So the surveillance has always been this kind of threat around the edges that isn't sort of the object that I'm looking at, but has always shaped the way that object works.
So what the people working on this project found was that it really wasn't enough to simply develop your own software, develop your own tools. They found that the parts of the internet that you take for granted, things like underwater cables, things like the actual computers you are using for your servers have ties to the United States, that they can't necessarily be trusted as being secure or safe or being away from the prying eyes of the NSA or the FBI or any other surveillance organization that you might not necessarily want to have watching your every move. And to Alex, this prospect ended up being a little disquieting, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, right now, at least, it's pretty dark. And there's things that folks have been developing. One thing that I think we're seeing is that in addition to, for example, the free software movement, or this idea that we need to be kind of developing our own digital tools so that we're not reliant on these big corporations that don't have our interests at heart, I think there's also a kind of growing movement to develop hardware that exists outside of this kind of existing framework that, like you mentioned, is very vulnerable. So I think about the cable project, and I'm not actually sure where it's at now, but the cable project that was being developed out of Brazil that was being designed specifically to bypass the U.S., sort of from its construction to its to the way that it was actually kind of laid in the earth. I think that is the level that is necessary to go to in order to really, truly, and all the way down evade the kind of surveillance that is really kind of ever present right now.
So unfortunately, we have to end on that dark note, because despite the fact that this isn't a great situation, that we wish we lived in a world where you could send things online without having to be worried about the NSA taking your data and storing it forever in a server somewhere, there's not really a great way to get around that. It's sort of a part of the unfortunate reality of the internet and the greater data center industrial complex as it exists today. And it's a part of our work as scholars to try to identify and confront these hidden forms of power and bring them to the forefront. But unfortunately, for the end of this episode, we do not have a lot of good advice if you want to avoid being tracked and monitored by all sorts of different surveillance organizations.
There's no real opting out, and we're focusing a little bit on the U.S. here because of the kind of interviews we're able to do. But similar things could be said about the UK, and there's quite a few sort of NSA-like entities.
CSIS here in Canada. Yeah.
On a smaller scale, maybe, CSIS. Yeah. But yeah, very much this sort of interconnection between internet infrastructure and an increased surveillance culture. And the justification for it, in some sense, through the promise of big data that we spoke about a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm. We're going to end this episode with another clip from our talk with Alex, and it's a really important one that really, I think, lays out this issue in clear terms, that it's both, on one hand, an issue of our information being captured and stored by these private companies that we don't have any democratic say over, and also an issue about a lot of the data center industrial complex, as it were, being an arm of American power, and a way for America as a state to, in a very real way, exert control over other countries and exert a global hegemony through digital infrastructure and through the internet. So thank you for listening. And to conclude, here is Alex Johnson with one more thought-provoking little snippet.
Right, is that I think the sort of first level of the conversation is shifting infrastructures towards the public domain, where at least they would be more accountable. I think that's one of the primary kind of critiques that gets launched against data centers specifically, but also around digital infrastructure more generally, is that there's just no meaningful regulation or no meaningful kind of public accountability. But then I think the next step, exactly as you put it, is thinking about these things as embedded in a world where imperial politics are ongoing, right? Where they're not only present in the after effects of the past, but they're still the way that the world is shaped. And so, for the Icelandic activists who I spoke with, who are trying to kind of, who had this vision of building a world outside of the sphere of U.S. influence, and then quickly realized that it came down to U.S. infrastructure and U.S. influence, right? Because, even if they were able to construct a kind of data haven that was legislatively and even infrastructurally independent of the U.S. At the end of the day, if the U.S. wants to access data that exists or moves through or is somehow meaningfully attached to Iceland, that's going to be a conversation between the U.S. government and the Icelandic government. And not a lot of people who I spoke with had faith that the Icelandic government was going to be able to stand up in a meaningful way. And so, at the end of the day, imperial politics is exactly what I land on. And that's the thing that we need to meaningfully shift in order to truly kind of escape these paradigms.